How many of you flew in or took a train in to get to London? Okay. I've been here about 5 hours. I'm very excited to be here. This is actually the fourth time in the last year that I've been in London to talk about security. And one of the things that's really striking to me is we put statistics up on these displays about how many users there are of Android, how many devices there are of Android. But it's when I look around that I start thinking and seeing how substantial and how humbling Android really is, right? I was on the plane yesterday. The device embedded in the seat in front of me was running Android. I look out the window as I go over Oakland, Denver, Salt Lake City, some other cities in the middle of the United States that I don't know what they are, New York. I think I saw some people on Greenland. All of those lights are houses, and maybe not every single one of them has an Android device in it, but probably around 80% of them do. So that's sort of the way I think about the world, is we've built something that extends into everyone's life, either directly or indirectly. And that's what we need to be thinking about securing. That's what we need to be thinking about making sure is able to satisfy all those use cases that Andre and David spoke about. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the role that Google has in that ecosystem, but I think that you all as partners play a really important role in that ecosystem as well in making sure that there's security there. We work with application developers, providing a wide range of different programs for them to build secure applications, everything from the foundation of the platform itself to the SDKs, and then I'll talk about some of the programs we have in place for application developers. We spend a lot of time with other members of what often gets described as the Android ecosystem, right? Makers of devices, OEMs, and carriers, to make sure that they're building devices that are able to be secure, maintaining those devices and providing security updates, and making sure that they're able to do that in a very effective way. And then we also deliver services directly to users in partnership with developers and device makers to make sure that those devices and the overall ecosystem continue to be secure. So I'll sort of talk through all of the ways that we do that by focusing on 3 different areas. First, the platform itself, right? When people think about Android, they tend to think about a device and an operating system. So let's talk about that operating system. We'll begin there, and then we'll discuss some of the services that Google's provided and the programs that we've put in place to make sure that the ecosystem is able to maintain itself and continue to be robust through updates and management of applications and devices out there in the ecosystem. When I think about operating systems that are mobile operating systems, I tend to think about 3 operating systems as being leaders in this space right now. Android obviously is one of them. iOS is the other. And Chrome OS is the third. Those are sort of the 3 operating systems that are really shaping the future of client computing right now out there in the world. This is sort of a listing of all of the features that have been introduced in Android over the last several releases. At this point, I'll be honest, I think there's basically feature parity for all 3 of those operating systems in terms of the security capabilities that they deliver as part of the operating system, right? They've isolated applications, they've built in exploit mitigations, we've enabled cryptographic checks both on the operating system and on the data that's on those devices. And so if you're looking at an Android 5.0 or newer devices or any of these mobile operating systems, we've got a relatively uniform set of capabilities across them. It's very, very powerful, and it's something that in your enterprise you should be thinking about. How do you transition away from those other operating systems that are so prevalent in your environment right now and make it possible to take advantage of these sort of more modern operating systems that are on the mobile platforms at this point. But one of the things that's unique about Android is the investment that we've made in validating the operating system, right? We obviously pour millions of dollars, maybe more than that, into making sure that it's a secure operating system. But we also have built programs that make it possible for us to pull in the intellectual capability and creativity of a broad research community outside of Google as well, even in many cases outside of sort of core Android development across our OEMs or our carrier partners. Google was at the forefront of developing something known as a bug bounty program, right? A vulnerability research program, where we started paying anybody who could find an issue. It didn't matter where they worked. And in fact, it turns out the majority of security researchers that are finding issues on Android are based in China, where Google doesn't have a significant presence, but there is a very significant use of Android and a very strong interest in making sure that Android is a secure operating system. At this point, the 3 largest bug bounty programs in the world are the ones for Google's properties, Chrome OS, and Android. all of them having hundreds of active researchers spread across the world and paying out about $1 million a year. The one that's the fastest growing is Android's, because it didn't exist a year and a half ago. So in about a year, we've gone from nothing to about 1 million, and I expect we'll probably be 1.5 million or 2 million by the end of this year at the current forecast that we're at right now. So we're very rapidly building an ecosystem, not just of security development within the platform itself, but of security research and really pushing the forefront of what it means to build a secure operating system. So that's what we're going to see, is Android beginning to advance faster and faster relative to the other mobile operating systems that are out there. The other way that we're investing that's unique is in the services that we deliver on top of Android. And this is something that Google, as an application developer, building our applications on top of Android, began thinking about very, very early on, right? Because our heritage is not as a platform providing company, but it's as a service providing company who needed to build security on top of those platforms. And so while we were building a secure platform, we were also building services in parallel with that. So I want to talk a minute or two about that. These services are included in the Google Mobile Services applications, right? Any device that ships with Google's applications has these services sort of baked into Google Play Services and Google Play itself. Completely transparent, nothing the user needs to do. They were designed to make sure that the best possible security services, everything from endpoint protections to antivirus to monitoring of some of the network capabilities to make sure that the network itself is not compromising a device. So we've incorporated those into the fabric of how our applications work. Right? So these are some of the things that we have there now. Verify apps to look at all the applications that are on a device, a sensor network that's looking at each of the applications on that device, as well as some of the network capabilities. Android Device Manager, because as it turns out, the most significant security risk faced by many users is that their device might be lost or stolen. So being able to recover that device or delete the data that's on that device is a critical piece of functionality. And one of the areas that we've been investing in significantly over the last year and a half is the realization that security is important at the operating system level, but many of the most critical decisions about how a device should be secured are actually taking place at the application level, right? You need to decide, should I delete my enterprise data out of my profile? Should I delete it out of this specific application? Should I only allow it to be unlocked on a device that's in a current in a particular situation? And so APIs that can be exposed to application developers and enterprises to allow those decisions to be pushed up the stack are one of those important aspects that we're working on right now. So what we've done in building these services is connect together all of the different parts of the Google application stack and allow an application developer or a consumer to take advantage of that. So I draw this in part to show that these pieces are all interconnected. I'm going to give you an example of how they're interconnected. We look at an application, right? How do we find applications? How do I know that over 95% of the applications that are installed, even from outside of Google Play, are an application that we've already analyzed? Well, some of them are submitted to Google Play, but Google also crawls the web to find applications. We find millions of applications that never get submitted to Google Play by doing the crawl on the web. We also embedded into Google Play the ability to check applications through Verify apps that are being installed from outside of the web, from outside of Google Play. And we allow the user to say, oh, this is one that hasn't been seen before, and this happens in the background. The user may or may not really know that this is happening, and we can upload that. We call that rare app collection. Right? So we have visibility into that. We extend that into safe browsing. So even if you're running an iOS device, you might have safe browsing turned on, because it's actually turned on inside of Safari. Or even if you're using Firefox on a Windows device, you have some protection relative to Android applications on those devices, right? So we're connecting all of these pieces together in order to have as much visibility into security across all of the different touch points that we have. Then we flow that into Gmail, so that if you receive an attachment, that application is analyzed. And so you can begin to see how all the pieces get connected together. Then we expose that as an API. So if you have an application that's running on an Android device, you can check to see whether any of the other applications that are on that device might be one that you need to be concerned about. Right? And so the pieces begin to connect together. So it's not as simple as you just protect your app store. It's about building connections across the ecosystem and all the different touch points in the ecosystem to have visibility and understanding of what's actually taking place. How often do we do this? We do it as often as we possibly can. We've got over 1 billion devices that have Google Mobile Services. We have over 1 billion devices that we're using to run SafetyNet and looking on what's going on in the ecosystem. We scan them very rigorously looking for potential security risks, and then adding protections onto those devices. This number says over 400 million scans. I think at this point it's about 790 million that are taking place every day. We've been increasing it on a regular basis, and the overall ecosystem is growing as well. And we're checking billions of applications every single day to monitor the types of behaviors that those applications might have and detect what's going on. So that's sort of the scale of what we're doing to try to understand what's going on. And it has an impact, right? I joined the Android team about 6 years ago, focused specifically on security. When I looked at the headlines when I was joining the team, it was like, this is going to be the end of days, right? The mobile environment is one that's so data rich, it's so scary, we're just going to see malware break out everywhere. And the estimates that we used to see, and the headlines we used to see were like 600% increase, 1,000% increase. This is what we've seen in terms of affected devices for the last 3 years, because we actually have data now. When I joined 6 years ago, there wasn't data. But we now have data. And we've been tracking it longitudinally for a number of years. There's earlier data as well. We had it for about a year and a half before this, but this is data that's in a consistent form for the entire period of time. And we haven't seen that growth. We've seen it in growth in interest. We've seen an increase in investment by the attackers. But because the defenses are in place, we've seen it be very, very stable. And in fact, it may not be obvious, but we're actually starting to see a decrease in the last year as we become more sophisticated in some of the analysis that we've been doing. So Andre and David both talked a little bit about unmanaged devices. And if you're in an unmanaged Android device, this is the sort of level of risk that you're exposed to in terms of potentially harmful applications on those devices. This compares very favorably, by the way, to the rates that we see for managed legacy workstations in terms of the prevalence of malware or potentially harmful applications on those devices. But if you're actually in an environment where you're able to do some management, you can be even more sophisticated. What's the simplest form of management that you can do? You can just say, only allow devices to install applications from Google Play, right? You don't need to do anything more than that. And the rate of potentially harmful applications drops by over 90%, right? So the top line here is devices that allow installation of applications from outside of Google Play. The bottom line is those devices that install only from Google Play. And there you see it drop literally by about 90% to under 0.1% of devices where we see an installation of potentially harmful application. Inside of Google, we go one step further. We take advantage of some of the Play features to restrict the set of applications that can be installed onto those devices. We have a fleet of somewhere between 50 and 100,000 Android devices, maybe 150,000, something in that neighborhood. The number of incidents we see is a couple, like literally a couple. I get a quarterly analysis of how many instances we've seen of events taking place on those devices. So it's extraordinarily rare. Several orders of magnitude different from what we see from our other operating systems in our environment. Which probably gets at the point that when you're reading about Android and when you're thinking about Android security, we ought to be very critical about the types of statements that are being made and look back and see whether or not some of the premonitions that we're hearing and some of the conversation that we're hearing take place. I'm in the security business. Anybody else in the security business? Anybody here have been to Black Hat? If you've been to Black Hat, not this year. This year was very quiet. So this slide is getting a little bit dated. I apologize for that. This was the first 3 years of Black Hat where Android was sort of the dominant topic. Master Key was a vulnerability that was discussed in 2012. Fake ID was 2013. I guess it's probably 13, 14, and then 15. And Stage Fright was the one that made front page news on the BBC. Well, it wouldn't have been on the front page on the BBC, but it was front page news on a number of places, and I ended up actually speaking to the BBC, right? Very, very prominent discussion about vulnerabilities that were affecting Android devices. And yet, nothing ever happened. That's the part that's really striking to me, is that we can look back with hindsight and analyze whether or not these claims that were made about the risks that users were being exposed to actually came to be realized. And it's stunning how much we've worried about this sort of collectively and how little has actually happened. But it's not that little has happened. It's that a lot has happened on the defensive side. Right? We've built up the capabilities to protect users, but we've also built up the capabilities to be able to monitor so we can actually see what's going on. And I think that's one of the things that we on the Google side kind of thought it was sufficient to just protect users. But it turns out what we need to be doing is being a lot more vocal about how we're protecting them and making sure that this kind of information is available. So one of the things that we started doing 2 years ago, the third one is in draft right now, is releasing an annual report where we try to summarize what we've been seeing across the Android ecosystem. This year's report is kind of boring, unfortunately. If you're looking for bedtime reading, it's about 100 pages long, and what it basically says is the trends that we've seen over the last several years are continuing, right? We've added significant new defenses, machine learning has improved, our ability to detect behaviors has been improving. The enterprise team here in London has added a bunch of features to allow us to do more detailed analysis of data on devices. We've extended safety net, but all in all, the Android ecosystem is continuing to be very safe, and the level of protections that we have is continuing to improve. For me, it's an interesting read, but it's not perhaps going to keep you up at night in the way that some of the other headlines that are out there will do. The one area that's been an incredibly large focus for us over the last year and a half has been around ecosystem updates. And there's two different ways that we talk about ecosystem updates from a security standpoint, and I want to talk about those. The first is application developers, and then the second is device makers. Device makers is what everybody thinks about. Application developers is actually the thing that I'm most excited about. I'll be totally honest. If you look into legacy operating systems, what you saw was the operating systems themselves were vulnerable for a number of years, and then all of the attacks ended up being against the applications. I headed up security for Adobe for several years, and Adobe became the forefront of attacks against Windows operating system because they were the application that was the most widely distributed. And so one of the things that we've been doing on Android is trying to make sure that application developers, most of whom don't come from Google, right? It could be any company that's out there that potentially becomes a widely distributed application and becomes a source of vulnerability. And so we've been building programs into Google Play to make sure that applications can be protected. There's a program that we have called the Application Security Improvements, where what we're doing is taking advantage of the scanning capabilities that we already have to look for malicious applications to identify potentially vulnerable applications, identify specific issues in those applications, and then reaching out to those developers to encourage them to fix it. We're looking for about 26 issues at this point. We've been expanding, month over month we add new ones that we're looking for. And we've seen a large number of improvements. Over 275,000 applications have been enhanced over the last year based on us identifying issues in those applications, reaching out to those developers, and encouraging them to fix those applications. So I think one of the important things is that we're going to be keeping not just the operating system secure, but the application ecosystem as well. The other area, though, that we've been spending a ton of time is on device makers. And so I want to talk a little bit about what it means to deliver updates into the ecosystem. In the United States especially, but in other areas of the world, Japan, to a lesser extent in Europe, carriers play a very significant role in making sure that device updates are able to get to a device. They don't actually produce those updates, but they're often involved in the distribution of those updates. And in many cases, historically, updates were treated as something that was detrimental from a carrier perspective, whether it was security or otherwise. The change to the user, the bandwidth that was consumed, those things were considered to be costs. And so many of the processes that were put in place in the mobile environment, not just for Android, but for all operating systems in the mobile environment, tried to slow down the delivery of those updates. And so we've been working with these carriers and others to make sure that they're able to receive security updates in a timely fashion. About a year and a half ago, it was basically impossible to get any kind of update, even the smallest security update, through many of the largest carriers in less than 6 to 9 weeks. We've worked with all the majors at this point, and they have security approval process specifically for security updates. We go through them with the Pixels on a monthly basis, Nexus devices on a monthly basis, Samsung, LG, a number of other partners go through them just as frequently as we do, where that approval process is now, in some instances, less than a day. But for almost all of them, less than a week. And so I can safely say that transition has taken place. We also have been working, in particular, focusing on high-end devices with the expectation that once we get this working really well with high-end devices, then we'll be able to move down further in stack in order to deliver across all of the ecosystem. So I want to talk for a minute about the math in the Android ecosystem. There was a slide earlier that said there are 24,000 devices in the Android ecosystem. That slide's wrong, by the way. We have data through safety net. I think there might be 24,000 physical devices. When we measured, we had over 75,000 unique software distribution with over 5,000 users. Right? So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the whole ecosystem. So let's look at a little chunk of it. Right? Let's talk about just the flagships for 5 OEMs. Well, what does it mean? Well, there's a couple of flagships for each of them. So it turns out across the world that ends up being about 25 to 29 different device models. There's a lot of different carriers. And those carriers have customizations. We're talking about 351 different carriers that we have to talk to, which ends up being about 5,000 device variants just to talk about the current flagship devices. So at the very least, if we can get the flagship devices updating, we're going to have an impact on both users being up to date, but also on demonstrating the ability for devices to be updated at scale across the ecosystem, right? Because now we're talking not about, the device that you see on a billboard on 101. We're talking about thousands of different devices in all kinds of different markets. So over the last year, we've seen some pretty substantial change there. Now, I want to be clear, right? This is not all devices. I'm not making any claim that it's all devices. This is current flagship devices. The beginning of the year, the frequency with which those devices were being updated on a monthly basis was very low. Fewer than 20% of those flagship devices were up to date in January of 2016. By the end of 2016, it was over 50%, right? So if I use sort of AV style math, it's like a 50,000% increase in where we were last. Actually, I guess it's about 500% increase from where we were. But in practice, what it is, it's a very significant movement, right? And it's a demonstration for a number of these OEMs that it's possible for them to update a set of their devices. And they're going through the process of re-architecting, being able to deliver that. Now, it's not good enough. I don't want to claim that it's good enough. We know what good enough looks like. Pixel's at about 90%. There are several devices from the other OEMs that are also at that same level. And in fact, Chrome OS is usually above 98 to 99% in their space. So we know there's a very high benchmark. This is leading, by the way. The Pixel's leading across the major mobile operating systems in terms of the rate of updates for those devices, right? So when people want to talk about devices being up to date, Pixel is definitely the one that's most aggressive at this point in getting those updates out into the mobile operating systems. So there's more work to be done, but we've been making very steady progress. And I think there's a lot more that we're going to be doing there. So the title of the talk was something along the lines of lots of devices, the biggest opportunity that's out there. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the ways that we've been seeing the security on these devices actually enable new business models and ways that you could be thinking about it in your environment as well. Do people know what this is? This is Pokemon Go. Pokemon Go is a probably around $1 billion run rate. I don't know what their actual revenue number is, so don't quote me on that, but it's something along those lines. Key to that is the ability to trust the operating system in the way that it's reporting location so that people don't cheat. Many of the security features that exist in Android came from DRM, or they came from protecting games. And as it turns out, Pokemon Go is one of the first and one of the largest users of SafetyNet's attestation API, where they can do real-time interrogation of a device to determine whether that device is one that has a certified version of Android running on the device in real time, whether it's one that the device has been rooted. Now that's an API that we made available thinking enterprises would love it and banks would love it. It turns out Pokemon Go is one of the largest users. Snapchat is one of our largest users. Enterprises are also quite large users, but none of the enterprise customers are even within, I don't know, a couple orders of magnitude of that. So we're seeing those kinds of use cases. Similarly, we've seen the rise of sharing economy, right? Taking advantage of the fact that there's a social network that's already existing on most of these devices, taking the fact that there's advantage of the fact that there's payment infrastructure already on these devices, and being able to build billion-dollar businesses on it. Could be Uber, could be Lyft. Didi Xiaoming, there's dozens of these different types of applications. Blackjet, if you want to look for that. I was trying to find the Uber of helicopters the other day when I was lost hiking in the mountains, but I don't think there is one. So there's a business opportunity if you're looking for ride sharing on helicopters. Android Pay takes advantage of the trust zone environment and the TEE to run some of its key management and some of its encryption of data inside of a trusted environment. So even in the event that the kernel is compromised on an Android device, those secrets are still protected inside of trust zone. Right? So these are technologies that were built originally for DRM, but that we're now taking advantage of to provide higher level confidence for cryptographic secrets that are unlocking opportunities that previously, if you went to a payment provider like a MasterCard, a Visa, or American Express, they were not comfortable with any of the desktop environments and delivering those kinds of capabilities. But Trust Zone and secure elements on these devices is unlocking that. Some people get really excited about world leaders who use Twitter from their Android device. I've got one more day. I had an engineer. I had an engineer who used to say that he would consider his job to be a success when Android was being used by a US president. I don't think he feels that way anymore. These are the people that I get really excited about, right? People who may be dealing with an oppressive regime and need to have confidence that they have a security environment for their data, but only have tens or 20s or maybe 50 US dollars to buy a device. So what they're turning to is Android, right? These pictures, it's just amazing to me that something that was designed for an entirely different purpose is being used, and the security of that device is what's enabling these people, right? The last connection that they have as they flee from some of these countries is their Android device, right? It has their contacts, it has their identity, it has their ability to connect to the entire world. So security is enabling all of those things. So I think the question that we ought to be thinking is, how can you be using it in your environment to transform your business? It's a relatively simple question, but it's one that I think we're at a point where we need to be asking that. Not is Android secure? The answer to that is indisputably yes. The question is, what can it do for you? So on that, I'm going to close, and I think we have a break now, about 30 minutes or so. And then I guess we'll be back here. My watch says 3:30. That's not even the right continent. I think 11:55 or so is when we'll be back here. So thank you very much.